Dr. Marcus Blackwood stood frozen in the sterile corridor of St. Mary's Hospital, his hands trembling as he held the medical chart that would change everything. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows on his weathered face, highlighting the deep lines that 23 years of practicing medicine had carved into his features. He had delivered thousands of babies, witnessed countless miracles, but nothing had prepared him for what lay behind the doors of room 247. Inside that room, Alessandro Draven paced like a caged animal. At 35, Alessandro commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout the city. His business empire stretched across multiple continents, built on foundations that most people preferred not to examine too closely. They called him the Vampire King behind his back, not because of any supernatural abilities, but because of his pale complexion, his tendency to conduct business during the darkest hours, and his reputation for draining his competitors dry without mercy. Alessandro's wife, Isabella, had been the one bright spot in his otherwise dark world. She was a former ballerina from Milan with golden hair that caught light like spun silk and eyes the color of Mediterranean waters. When she became pregnant, something shifted in Alessandro's hardened heart. For the first time in his life, he began to imagine a future that wasn't built on power and intimidation. The pregnancy had been difficult from the beginning. Isabella suffered from severe complications that required constant medical supervision. Dr. Blackwood had been personally overseeing her care, knowing that any mistake could result in consequences far worse than a malpractice lawsuit. Alessandro had made it clear that his wife and child's well-being was the only thing that mattered to him, and everyone in the hospital understood the unspoken threat behind those words. 3 days ago, Isabella had gone into premature labor. The delivery had been traumatic, with complications that pushed both mother and child to the edge of death. When the baby finally emerged, he wasn't breathing. His tiny body was blue and lifeless, weighing barely 4 pounds. The medical team worked frantically for 47 minutes, trying every technique in their arsenal to coax life into the infant's still form. Dr. Blackwood had been the one to make the devastating announcement. "Mr. Draven, I'm deeply sorry. We've done everything possible, but your son, he's gone." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any of Alessandro's legendary outbursts of rage. He simply stood there, staring at the small, still form of his son, while Isabella sobbed inconsolably in the hospital bed. The baby had been pronounced dead at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, with the official cause listed as severe respiratory distress and cardiac failure. But Alessandro refused to accept defeat. He had built his empire by never surrendering, by finding solutions where others saw only problems. If his money and influence could buy anything, surely it could buy his son's life. He demanded that the baby be kept on life support, that every possible specialist be consulted, that experimental treatments be attempted. The hospital administration, terrified of defying him, reluctantly agreed to maintain artificial life support while keeping the child in the intensive care unit. For 3 days, the tiny body lay connected to machines that breathed for him, that circulated his blood, that performed every function his organs could not. Medical experts from around the world were flown in for consultations, but their verdicts were unanimous. The child's brain showed no activity, his organs had shut down, and there was no hope of recovery. Dr. Blackwood had tried to reason with Alessandro multiple times. "Mr. Draven, I understand your pain, but we need to accept reality. Your son is gone. Keeping him on these machines isn't bringing him back. It's just prolonging the inevitable." Each time Alessandro's response was the same. His dark eyes would fix on the doctor with an intensity that made grown men step backward. "He's my son," he would say in a voice barely above a whisper, "and I decide when to give up on him." The hospital staff began to whisper among themselves. Some felt sympathy for a father's desperate denial, while others worried about the resources being wasted on a hopeless case. The machines hummed constantly in the neonatal intensive care unit, keeping the baby's body functioning while his spirit remained absent. Isabella had been released from the hospital the day before, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. She spent every waking moment beside the incubator talking to her son, singing Italian lullabies that her own mother had sung to her. She would place her hand against the glass barrier, hoping to somehow transfer her life force to the tiny body that lay motionless inside. On this particular evening, as Dr. Blackwood made his rounds, he noticed something that made him pause. In the far corner of the neonatal unit, a young girl was mopping the floor. She couldn't have been more than 16. With dark skin and hands that spoke of years of hard labor, her uniform was too large for her thin frame, and her shoes had holes that she tried to hide by walking carefully. The girl's name was Maya Rodriguez, though most of the hospital staff simply called her the cleaning girl if they acknowledged her existence at all. Maya had been working at St. Mary's Hospital for 8 months, taking the night shift because it paid slightly better than the day shift. She sent most of her earnings home to her grandmother in Honduras, keeping only enough to pay for the tiny room she rented in the city's most dangerous neighborhood. Maya had no education beyond the 8th grade, no family connections, no prospects for a better future. But she had something that couldn't be taught in medical school or bought with money. She had faith that ran deeper than the ocean, passed down through generations of women who had survived poverty, violence, and heartbreak through the power of prayer. Every night as she cleaned the hospital floors, Maya would quietly pray for the patients she saw. She prayed for the elderly man in room 203 who called out for his deceased wife. She prayed for the young mother in the maternity ward who struggled with postpartum depression. And for the past 3 nights, she had been drawn to the neonatal unit, where she felt a strange calling to pray for the baby everyone said was gone. Tonight was different. As Maya worked her way through the unit, she found herself stopping beside the incubator that held Alessandro's son. The machines beeped rhythmically, creating an artificial symphony that spoke of technology's limitations rather than life's triumph. She looked at the tiny face, peaceful in its stillness, and felt her heart break for the parents she had seen maintaining their vigil. Maya glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then quietly began to whisper a prayer in Spanish. It was an old prayer, one her grandmother had taught her, speaking of God's power to breathe life into the lifeless, to make the impossible possible. As she prayed, she placed her hand gently on the incubator, feeling the warmth of the machines that were working so hard to maintain the illusion of life. What happened next would be debated by medical professionals for years to come. Some would call it coincidence, others would speak of miraculous intervention. But Maya felt a sensation she had never experienced before. It was as if electricity flowed from her fingertips into the incubator, as if something powerful and ancient was working through her. The first sign was subtle, a small twitch in the baby's left hand, so slight that it could have been mistaken for the mechanical movement caused by the ventilator. But Maya saw it, and she continued praying with increased intensity. She prayed not just with words, but with every fiber of her being, calling on every saint she had ever learned about, every miracle she had ever heard of. Then it happened. The baby's eyes fluttered open. Maya gasped, stepping backward and nearly knocking over her mop bucket. The baby's eyes were dark like his father's, but they held a clarity that no newborn should possess. For a moment, they seemed to focus directly on Maya, as if acknowledging her presence, her prayer, her faith. The monitors began to change. Heart rate, previously maintained artificially, began to show natural rhythm. Brain activity, absent for 3 days, suddenly spiked on the EEG machine. Oxygen saturation levels, supported entirely by the ventilator, began to improve as the baby's own lungs started to function. Maya ran from the unit, her heart pounding with terror and amazement. She had witnessed something that challenged everything she thought she knew about life and death. As she fled, alarms began to sound throughout the neonatal unit. Medical staff rushed toward the incubator, their faces showing confusion and disbelief as they observed readings that should have been impossible. Dr. Blackwood was the first to reach the baby. He looked at the monitors, checked them twice, then began a rapid physical examination. The baby's color was improving, changing from the deathly blue-gray to a healthy pink. His tiny chest rose and fell with increasing strength, and when the doctor shined a light in his eyes, the pupils responded. Normally, this can't be happening. Doctor, Blackwood muttered to himself, but the evidence was undeniable. The child who had been pronounced dead 3 days earlier was not only alive, but showing signs of normal neurological function. Alessandro and Isabella arrived within minutes, having been summoned by the frantic call from the nursing staff. They burst into the unit to find their son's eyes open, his tiny hand grasping at the air as if reaching for something only he could see. Isabella collapsed beside the incubator, sobbing with joy and disbelief. Alessandro stood silently, his face a mask of emotions he had spent years learning to suppress. He had commanded respect through fear, had built an empire through ruthless determination. But in this moment, he was simply a father witnessing something that defied explanation. Dr. Alessandro's voice was hoarse with emotion. What happened? How is this possible? Dr. Wheaton, Blackwood shook his head, his medical training warring with what his eyes were telling him. I don't know, Mr. Draven. By every medical standard, your son was gone. Brain death, organ failure, complete lack of response to any stimuli. What we're seeing now, it's not medically possible. But possible or not, the baby continued to improve throughout the night. His vital signs stabilized, his reflexes returned, and by morning he was breathing entirely on his own. The medical team ran every test imaginable, searching for some explanation, some overlooked factor that could account for what they had witnessed. The tests revealed something even more astounding. Not only was the baby alive and healthy, but scans showed no signs of the brain damage that should have resulted from 3 days without oxygen. His organs functioned perfectly, his nervous system responded normally, and his development appeared to be proceeding as if nothing had ever been wrong. Word of the miraculous recovery spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses whispered about the baby who had come back from the dead. Doctors debated the medical impossibility of what they had witnessed, and administrators worried about the media attention such a story might attract. Alessandro hired private security to keep reporters away from the hospital, but he couldn't silence the staff members who had witnessed the inexplicable event. Within days, rumors were circulating throughout the city about the Vampire King's child who had conquered death itself. But Alessandro was more interested in finding answers than managing publicity. He demanded to know everything that had happened in the neonatal unit during the night of his son's recovery. Security cameras were reviewed, staff members were questioned, and every detail was scrutinized for clues. It was during this investigation that Maya's presence in the unit was discovered. The security footage showed her praying beside the incubator, her hand placed on the glass just moments before the baby's vital signs began to change. But when Alessandro's people went looking for her, they discovered that Maya Rodriguez had disappeared. She had finished her shift that night, collected her final paycheck, and simply vanished from the city. Her tiny rented room was empty, her few possessions gone, and none of her co-workers knew where she had planned to go. It was as if she had never existed, leaving behind only the mystery of what had transpired in those crucial moments beside the incubator. Alessandro became obsessed with finding the girl who might hold the key to understanding his son's miracle. He deployed resources that rivaled those of law enforcement agencies. Following every lead, investigating every possibility, his search took him into the city's poorest neighborhoods, where people spoke in whispers about a young woman who had the gift of healing, who could pray the sick back to health, but Maya had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Some said she had returned to Honduras, others claimed she had moved to a different city, and a few whispered that she had never been real at all, that she was an angel sent to save the Vampire King's child. As the weeks passed, Alessandro's son continued to thrive. They named him Gabriel, and he grew with a vitality that amazed everyone who saw him. But Alessandro couldn't shake the feeling that his son's story was far from over, that the mysterious girl who had disappeared held secrets that could change everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the power of faith. The medical community remained baffled by Gabriel's recovery. Dr. Blackwood published a carefully worded paper about the case, describing it as an extremely rare instance of misdiagnosis rather than acknowledging the supernatural implications that kept him awake at night. But privately, he knew that what he had witnessed challenged every assumption he had made about the boundaries between life and death. Isabella recovered fully from the trauma of the delivery and threw herself into caring for her miraculous son. She often spoke about the feeling she had experienced during those dark days, the sense that someone was watching over them, protecting Gabriel when medical science had failed. Alessandro, meanwhile, found himself changed by the experience. The man who had built his reputation on controlling every aspect of his world had been humbled by forces beyond his understanding. He continued his search for Maya Rodriguez, not just out of curiosity, but out of a desperate need to understand how a powerless girl had accomplished what all his wealth and influence could not. 2 years had passed since Gabriel Draven's miraculous recovery, and the boy had grown into something extraordinary. At age 2, he displayed intelligence that astounded child development experts and physical abilities that defied medical explanation. Gabriel could speak in complete sentences in 3 languages, solve puzzles designed for children twice his age, and seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of people's emotions that unnerved even his parents. Alessandro had never stopped searching for Maya Rodriguez. His investigation had evolved from a simple manhunt into an obsession that consumed increasing amounts of his time and resources. Private detectives, international search firms, and even government contacts had been employed in the effort to locate the mysterious girl who had vanished after saving his son's life. The search had led Alessandro down paths he never expected to explore. His investigators had uncovered stories of miraculous healings in small villages throughout Central America, tales of a young woman who appeared in times of desperate need and disappeared just as mysteriously. But every lead seemed to evaporate just when they got close to finding her. Dr. Blackwood had become an unlikely ally in Alessandro's quest. The physician's scientific worldview had been shattered by what he had witnessed that night in the hospital, and he found himself drawn into research that his colleagues would have considered career suicide. He had quietly documented dozens of cases of medically inexplicable recoveries, searching for patterns that might explain Gabriel's resurrection. Isabella, meanwhile, had developed her own theories about their son's miracle. She had begun attending church regularly, something she hadn't done since childhood, and spent hours reading about saints and miracles. She believed that Gabriel had been chosen for some special purpose, that his return from death was part of a divine plan that would eventually reveal itself. The family's life had settled into a strange normalcy. Alessandro continued to run his business empire, though with less ruthless intensity than before. Isabella devoted herself to raising Gabriel, documenting every milestone and peculiarity in detailed journals. And Gabriel himself seemed to accept his extraordinary abilities as completely natural, displaying the unquestioned confidence that only children possess. It was on a rainy Thursday evening in November when everything changed again. Alessandro had been working late in his home office, reviewing reports from his latest team of investigators, when his phone rang. The call came from Father Miguel Santos, a priest from a small parish in Guatemala City, who had been contacted through Alessandro's network of informants. "Mr. Draven," Father Santos spoke in heavily accented English, "I believe I have information about the young woman you seek. But this is not a conversation for the telephone. If you truly wish to find her, you must come here to my church. And you must come alone." Alessandro's heart raced as he processed the priest's words. After 2 years of dead ends and false leads, could this finally be the breakthrough he had been desperately seeking? He made arrangements immediately, using one of his private jets to fly to Guatemala within hours of receiving the call. The flight gave Alessandro time to reflect on how dramatically his life had changed since Gabriel's birth. The man who had once solved problems through intimidation and violence now found himself seeking answers in churches and chasing miracles across international borders. His transformation had been gradual but profound, driven by the inexplicable love he felt for his son and the mystery surrounding the boy's survival. Guatemala City assaulted Alessandro's senses as he made his way through streets that spoke of poverty and struggle. He had visited many dangerous places in his business dealings, but this felt different. Here, desperation and hope seemed to exist side by side, creating an atmosphere that was both threatening and strangely spiritual. Father Santos's church was located in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, a small stone building that had clearly seen better days. Paint peeled from its walls, and the wooden doors hung slightly askew on ancient hinges. But when Alessandro entered, he was struck by the sense of peace that permeated the simple space. Father Santos was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor before his calling to the priesthood. His face was lined with compassion and weariness in equal measure, and his eyes held the depth of someone who had witnessed both profound suffering and inexplicable joy. "Mr. Draven," the priest said as they sat in a small office behind the altar, "before I tell you what I know, I must ask you a question. Why do you seek this girl? Is it gratitude, curiosity, or something darker?" Alessandro considered the question carefully before responding. "Father, I've spent 2 years trying to understand what happened to my son. Every doctor, every expert, every test says that what occurred was impossible. But I saw it happen. This girl, Maya, she was there when my son came back to life. I need to know how, and I need to know why." Father Santos nodded slowly. "Maya Rodriguez came to me 3 months ago. She was sick, dying actually, from a cancer that had spread throughout her body. She had been hiding her illness for over a year, continuing to work despite her pain, sending money home to her grandmother even as she grew weaker." Alessandro felt his breath catch. "She's dying?" "She was dying," Father Santos corrected, "but something changed when she arrived here. She told me about what happened in your hospital, about the prayer she offered for your son. She believed that God had used her as an instrument of healing, but she also believed that the effort had somehow transferred your son's death into her own body." The priest's words hit Alessandro like a physical blow. The idea that Maya might have sacrificed her own life to save Gabriel's was something he had never considered, despite all his research into miraculous healings. "She spent weeks in prayer and fasting," Father Santos continued. "She was seeking forgiveness for what she saw as her presumption in interfering with God's will. But gradually her cancer began to disappear. Not slowly, as sometimes happens with treatment, but rapidly, completely, as if it had never existed." Alessandro struggled to process this information. "Where is she now?" "That's what I need to explain to you," Father Santos said. "Maya believes that your son's miracle created a connection between them, a spiritual bond that transcends normal understanding. She has been having visions, dreams of a darkness that threatens to claim Gabriel unless he learns to control the power that saved him." The priest reached into his desk and withdrew a letter written in careful Spanish script. "She asked me to give you this if you ever came looking for her. She said you would come eventually, that the bond between her and your son would draw you here." Alessandro's hands trembled as he took the letter. Even though he couldn't read Spanish fluently, he recognized the simple, honest handwriting of someone with limited education but unlimited faith. "What does it say?" he asked. Father Santos translated slowly. "Dear Mr. Draven, I know you have been searching for me, and I know why. Your son Gabriel is special, but his gift comes with a price that you do not yet understand. The power that brought him back from death is growing stronger as he grows older. If he is not taught to control it, it could consume him and everything he touches. I am writing this because I believe God has given me a mission to help Gabriel learn to use his abilities for good rather than destruction. If you receive this letter, bring Gabriel to the village of San Miguel Arcangel in the mountains above Antigua. Come on the feast day of St. Michael, and come prepared to accept truths that your mind will resist. Do not bring guards or weapons or money. Bring only your son and your willingness to believe in something greater than yourself." Alessandro read through the translation several times, his analytical mind warring with intuition that told him this was his only path forward. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate scheme to kidnap my son? How do I know she's really who she claims to be? Father Santos smiled sadly. Mr. Draven, what would a poor girl from Honduras want with your money? She has already demonstrated the ability to perform miracles. If she meant harm to Gabriel, don't you think she could have inflicted it 2 years ago when he was helpless in that hospital? The priest had a point, but Alessandro's suspicious nature fought against accepting something so completely beyond his control. The feast day of St. Michael, he said. When is that? September 29th, Father Santos replied. Still 10 months away. She chose that date deliberately, to give you time to observe Gabriel, to see the signs she speaks of. She said you would understand when the time comes. Alessandro left Guatemala with more questions than answers, but he was carrying something he hadn't possessed in 2 years: hope. Not just hope of finding Maya, but hope of understanding the extraordinary circumstances surrounding his son's life. The months that followed were marked by increasingly unusual incidents involving Gabriel. The boy's intelligence continued to develop at an alarming rate, but more troubling were the physical phenomena that began to manifest around him. Electronics would malfunction when Gabriel became emotional, temperatures would drop suddenly when he was upset, and on several occasions Isabella swore she had seen objects move slightly when Gabriel stared at them intently. Dr. Blackwood, who had been monitoring Gabriel's development, became increasingly concerned about these manifestations. He conducted numerous tests, all of which came back normal, but the incidents continued to escalate. During one particularly dramatic episode, Gabriel's fever had spiked to 105 degrees, and every piece of medical equipment in his hospital room had simultaneously shut down, only to restart normally when his temperature returned to normal. Isabella began to understand what Maya's letter had warned about. She could see the power growing in her son, could sense the effort it took him to control impulses and abilities that no 2-year-old should possess. She started documenting these incidents, creating a detailed record that she hoped might help Maya understand Gabriel's condition when they finally met. Alessandro, meanwhile, threw himself into research with the same intensity he had once applied to business. He studied religious texts, interviewed experts in paranormal phenomena, and even consulted with physicists who specialized in quantum mechanics. Nothing in his investigation provided satisfactory explanations for what Gabriel could do, but the research did convince him that Maya's warning about the need for control was genuine. As September approached, Alessandro made the difficult decision to follow Maya's instructions exactly. Against the advice of his security team, against Isabella's fears about traveling to an unstable region, and against his own instincts for careful planning, he would take Gabriel to Guatemala with minimal protection and maximum faith. The feast day of St. Michael arrived with unseasonably heavy rains throughout Guatemala. Alessandro and Gabriel flew into Guatemala City on a commercial flight, having left behind the private jets and luxury accommodations that normally accompanied Alessandro's travel. They rented a simple car and drove through muddy mountain roads toward the village of San Miguel Arcangel. Gabriel, now able to walk and speak with remarkable clarity for his age, seemed unusually calm during the journey. He spent the drive looking out the window at the misty mountains, occasionally pointing at birds or clouds and making observations that seemed far too sophisticated for a 2-year-old. "Papa," Gabriel said as they climbed higher into the mountains, "the lady in my dreams says we're going to meet her soon." Alessandro nearly swerved off the narrow road. "What lady, Gabriel? What dreams?" "The lady who helped me when I was sleeping in the hospital," Gabriel replied matter-of-factly. "She comes to my dreams sometimes and teaches me things. With trust, Teddy, she says I have to learn to be careful with my gifts." This was the first time Gabriel had ever mentioned dreams about Maya, and Alessandro realized that his son might understand far more about his situation than anyone had suspected. The boy's casual acceptance of his supernatural experiences was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The village of San Miguel Arcangel consisted of perhaps 50 small houses clustered around a central square dominated by a simple white church. As Alessandro parked their rental car, he noticed that despite the heavy rain, many of the villagers were gathered in the square, as if they had been waiting for something. An elderly woman approached their car, her weathered face breaking into a warm smile when she saw Gabriel. "Welcome," she said in accented English. "Maya is waiting for you in the church. She said to tell you that the time for questions is over. Now is the time for understanding." Alessandro carried Gabriel through the rain toward the church, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. After 2 years of searching, he was finally going to face the mysterious girl who had saved his son's life. But more than that, he was going to learn truths about Gabriel's nature that would change everything he thought he knew about his family's future. The Church of San Miguel Arcangel was dimly lit by dozens of candles that cast dancing shadows on the simple stone walls. As Alessandro carried Gabriel through the heavy wooden doors, the scent of burning wax and ancient incense enveloped them. At the front of the church, near the altar, a young woman knelt in prayer. Maya Rodriguez had changed dramatically in the 2 years since she had disappeared from the hospital. Where once she had been thin and worn down by poverty, she now possessed a serenity that seemed to radiate from her very presence. Her dark hair was longer, framing a face that showed wisdom far beyond her 18 years. When she turned to face them, her eyes held depths that spoke of suffering transcended and purpose discovered. Gabriel immediately began to squirm in Alessandro's arms, reaching toward Maya with the excitement of a child recognizing a beloved friend. "It's her, Papa! It's the lady from my dreams!" Maya rose gracefully and approached them, her simple white dress rustling softly in the hushed church. She smiled at Gabriel with genuine warmth, then looked directly at Alessandro with an expression that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed defenses. "Mr. P. Draven," she said in English that was much improved from her hospital days, "thank you for trusting me enough to come. I know how difficult this journey has been for you." Alessandro set Gabriel down, watching as his son immediately ran to Maya and threw his small arms around her waist. The familiarity between them was unmistakable, as if they had indeed been meeting in some realm beyond normal understanding. "You look different," Alessandro said, struggling to reconcile this poised young woman with the frightened cleaning girl he remembered from the hospital security footage. Maya nodded, settling onto one of the wooden pews with Gabriel beside her. "I am different. The night I prayed for Gabriel, something changed in both of us. I've spent these 2 years learning to understand what happened and why. Then explain it to me," Alessandro said, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to wielding. "Tell me how my dead son came back to life, and tell me why you disappeared." Maya's expression remained calm despite the intensity in Alessandro's tone. "Your son never truly died, Mr. Draven. What the doctors declared as death was something else entirely. Gabriel's spirit had separated from his body, but it hadn't departed to whatever lies beyond this world. He was caught between life and death, trapped by a force that your medical science doesn't recognize." She paused, watching Alessandro's face carefully before continuing. "Gabriel is what some traditions call a bridge soul, someone born with the ability to move between the physical world and spiritual realms. These gifts often manifest as what people call miracles, but they come with tremendous responsibility and potential danger." Alessandro struggled to process this information. "You're talking about supernatural abilities. Magic. That's impossible." Gabriel looked up at his father with the patient expression of a child who understands things that adults refuse to accept. "Papa, watch this," he said simply. The boy focused his attention on one of the altar candles that had burned down to almost nothing. As Alessandro and Maya watched, the tiny flame began to grow, rising higher and brighter until it illuminated the entire front of the church. Gabriel giggled with delight at his accomplishment, then allowed the flame to return to its normal size. Alessandro felt his worldview crumble completely. After 2 years of denying what he had witnessed, of searching for rational explanations for the impossible, he was finally confronting the truth about his son's nature. "How is this possible?" he whispered. Maya took Gabriel's hand, and the boy immediately calmed, as if her touch helped him control the energy that constantly flowed through him. Gabriel died for 47 minutes in that hospital. During that time, his spirit traveled to places where the boundaries between possible and impossible don't exist. When I prayed for him that night, I wasn't asking for healing in the way most people understand it. I was calling his spirit back to his body, bridging the gap between life and death through faith. She stood and walked to one of the stained glass windows, where the colored light cast rainbow patterns across her face. But the process changed him. Gabriel came back with abilities that most humans don't possess. He can influence energy, matter, even the thoughts and emotions of others when his gifts are fully developed. In the wrong hands or without proper training, these abilities could be incredibly dangerous. Alessandro joined her at the window, his mind racing as he considered the implications of what she was telling him. "Is that why you disappeared? Because you were afraid of what you had done?" "I disappeared because I knew you would search for me," Maya replied. "And I knew that when you found me it would be because Gabriel's abilities had developed to the point where you finally accepted the truth. I needed time to prepare, to learn how to help him control his gifts." She turned back to face Alessandro, her expression serious. "Gabriel's abilities will continue to grow stronger as he matures. If he learns to use them wisely, he could heal the sick, bring peace to troubled hearts, even prevent great tragedies. But if he's consumed by anger, fear, or hatred, he could cause destruction on a scale you can't imagine." Alessandro looked at his son, who was now quietly examining the intricate carvings on the church pews, running his small fingers over the wood as if reading stories written in the grain. "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to let me teach him," Maya said. "Gabriel needs to learn not just how to control his abilities, but why they were given to him. He needs to understand the difference between power used for selfish gain and power used in service of others." The request hit Alessandro like a physical blow. After losing Gabriel once, the idea of allowing him to be trained by someone else, especially in a remote village thousands of miles from home, seemed impossible to accept. "You want me to leave my son with you?" Alessandro's voice carried the edge of threat that had intimidated countless business rivals. Maya met his gaze without flinching. "I'm asking you to trust me with Gabriel's future, just as you trusted me with his life 2 years ago. But I'm not suggesting that you abandon him. Stay here, learn alongside him. See for yourself what he's capable of becoming." As if summoned by their conversation, Father Santos appeared in the church doorway. Behind him came several villagers, including the elderly woman who had greeted Alessandro earlier. They moved quietly into the pews, creating an audience for whatever was about to unfold. "These people have been expecting us," Maya explained. "This village has been a sanctuary for those with unusual gifts for generations. The people here understand what Gabriel is, and they can help provide the environment he needs to develop safely." Gabriel looked up from his examination of the pew carvings, his dark eyes moving from face to face among the assembled villagers. Suddenly, he smiled with pure joy and clapped his hands together. As he did, every candle in the church blazed brighter, filling the space with warm, golden light. The villagers murmured prayers of gratitude and wonder, clearly familiar with supernatural manifestations but still moved by the beauty of Gabriel's unconscious display of power. Alessandro felt a profound shift in his understanding. For 2 years, he had been trying to solve the mystery of his son's resurrection using logic, money, and influence. But standing in this simple church surrounded by people who accepted miracles as naturally as breathing, he finally understood that some questions could only be answered through faith. "If I agree to this," Alessandro said slowly, "what guarantee do I have that Gabriel will be safe? How do I know that teaching him to use these abilities won't put him in even greater danger?" Maya walked over to Gabriel and knelt beside him. "Gabriel, show your father what you showed me in your dreams." The boy nodded seriously and placed his small hand against a crack in the church's stone wall. Alessandro watched in amazement as the crack began to seal itself, the stone flowing like liquid before hardening again, leaving the wall completely restored. "Gabriel healed this church," Maya explained. But more than that, he healed the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. His gifts aren't meant for destruction, Mr. Draven. They're meant for restoration, for bringing wholeness to a broken world. Alessandro knelt beside his son, looking into eyes that held wisdom no 2-year-old should possess. Gabriel, do you understand what Maya is offering to teach you? She wants to help me be good with my gifts. Gabriel replied with the simple clarity of childhood. Like how you taught me to be careful with sharp things, she wants to teach me to be careful with the special things I can do. The innocence and trust in his son's voice finally broke through Alessandro's resistance. He had built his empire by never showing weakness, by maintaining control at all costs, but in this moment he realized that the greatest act of strength might be surrender. How long? Alessandro asked Maya. How long would this training take? Years, Maya replied honestly. Gabriel's abilities will continue developing until he reaches adulthood, but the foundation, the most critical learning that needs to happen now while his heart is still pure, before the world has a chance to corrupt his intentions. Alessandro stood and walked to the front of the church, where a statue of St. Michael stood with sword raised against the forces of darkness. He had never been a religious man, had built his success on trusting only himself and his own power, but Gabriel's miracle had opened him to possibilities he had never imagined. If I agree to this, he said, turning back to face Maya and Gabriel, I have conditions. I want regular communication with my son. I want to be involved in his education, to understand what he's learning. And I want your word that if Gabriel ever wants to leave, if he ever asks for his family, you won't try to keep him. Maya nodded solemnly. Those are reasonable requests, and I accept them gladly. But I have a condition of my own. Alessandro waited for her to continue. You must also learn, Maya said. Gabriel will need his father to understand his gifts, to support him when the training becomes difficult. I'm not just offering to teach Gabriel, Mr. Draven. I'm offering to teach your entire family how to live with and nurture extraordinary abilities. The proposition was more than Alessandro had expected, but as he considered it, he realized it might be exactly what their family needed. Isabella's growing interest in spirituality, his own questions about the nature of reality, Gabriel's obvious need for guidance. Perhaps they could all benefit from Maya's instruction. There's something else you need to know, Maya continued. Gabriel isn't the only child born with these gifts. There are others scattered around the world, many of them struggling without proper guidance. Part of Gabriel's destiny may involve helping them, creating a network of healers and peacemakers who can address problems that conventional solutions can't touch. Alessandro looked at his son, who was now sitting quietly in one of the pews, apparently fascinated by the way the candlelight played across the church's ancient stones. It was difficult to imagine this small boy as part of some grand cosmic plan, but Gabriel's abilities were undeniably real and continuing to grow stronger. I need time to think about this, Alessandro said finally, and I need to discuss it with my wife. This affects all of us. Maya smiled with understanding. Of course. Take all the time you need. Gabriel and I will be here when you're ready to begin. As if responding to some unheard signal, Gabriel hopped down from the pew and ran to his father. Papa, Maya says I can learn to help sick people get better, like she helped me get better. Would that be good? Alessandro picked up his son, feeling the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. Yes, Gabriel, I think that would be very good. 3 months later, the Draven family relocated to San Miguel Arcangel. Alessandro established a small office in Antigua that allowed him to manage his business empire remotely while remaining close to Gabriel's training. Isabella threw herself into learning Spanish and studying the village's traditions of faith healing and spiritual guidance. Gabriel's education began slowly, with Maya teaching him meditation techniques and simple exercises in controlling his emotional responses to various stimuli. As his control improved, she gradually introduced more advanced concepts, helping him understand the responsibility that came with his extraordinary gifts The transformation in the entire family was remarkable. Alessandro found himself questioning assumptions he had held his entire life, developing a sense of purpose that went beyond accumulating wealth and power. Isabella discovered a spiritual depth that gave new meaning to her role as Gabriel's mother, and Gabriel himself blossomed under Maya's careful guidance, learning to channel his abilities toward healing rather than destruction. Dr. Blackwood visited several times, documenting Gabriel's development and gradually accepting that medical science had encountered something beyond its current understanding. His reports, carefully worded to avoid ridicule from his colleagues, began to open new discussions about the relationship between consciousness, faith, and physical healing. As Gabriel approached his 4th birthday, his abilities had stabilized under Maya's training. He could heal minor injuries with a touch, could sense illness in others before symptoms appeared, and could project a sense of peace and calm that was particularly effective with frightened or troubled children. But perhaps the most significant change was in Alessandro himself. The man once known as the Vampire King had discovered that true power came not from inspiring fear, but from nurturing hope. He began using his resources to support medical clinics, educational programs, and economic development projects throughout Guatemala and beyond. Maya's prediction about other gifted children proved accurate. Word of Gabriel's abilities and the success of his training began to attract families from around the world who were struggling with children who possessed unusual gifts. The village of San Miguel Arcangel gradually became an informal center for research into what Maya called bridge souls, individuals who could serve as conduits between the physical and spiritual realms. On Gabriel's 4th birthday, as the family gathered in the little church where their journey had truly begun, Alessandro reflected on how completely his life had been transformed. The cynical businessman who had once solved problems through intimidation had become a man of faith, devoted to helping others discover and develop their own spiritual gifts. Gabriel, now a confident and compassionate 4-year-old, had shown that his miraculous survival was not just a personal blessing, but the beginning of a mission that would touch countless lives. Under Maya's continued guidance, he was learning to use his extraordinary abilities not for personal gain, but in service of healing a world that desperately needed hope. Maya herself had evolved from a frightened teenage cleaning girl into a wise teacher whose understanding of spiritual matters drew seekers from around the globe. The transformation she had undergone in those crucial months after Gabriel's healing had prepared her for a role she never could have imagined. As Alessandro watched his son blow out the candles on his birthday cake, causing all the church candles to flicker in sympathetic response, he marveled at the journey that had brought them to this point. Gabriel's brief death and miraculous resurrection had seemed like an ending, the successful conclusion to a desperate father's fight for his child's life. But it had actually been a beginning, the first chapter in a story that would continue to unfold in ways that none of them could fully predict. Gabriel's gifts would continue to develop. Maya's teaching would reach ever wider circles of students, and Alessandro's transformation from feared businessman to spiritual seeker would inspire others to examine their own relationship with power and purpose. The Vampire King's child had indeed conquered death, but more than that, he had conquered the darkness that had defined his father's life for so many years. In saving Gabriel, Maya had saved them all, creating a legacy of healing and hope that would extend far beyond the simple village church where miracles had become as natural as morning prayers. Years later, when Gabriel had grown into a young man whose healing abilities were known throughout Central America, he would often speak about the night he returned from death. But he would always emphasize that the real miracle wasn't his resurrection. It was the transformation of all the lives that had been touched by his story. Maya's faith had called him back from the darkness, but it was the love of his family and the support of an entire community that had given him the strength to become the healer he was meant to be. And Alessandro, the man who had once been known for taking life and crushing spirits, had discovered that his true calling was nurturing the miraculous potential that existed within every human soul. In the end, Gabriel's story was not about conquering death. It was about choosing life in all its complexity, mystery, and infinite possibility for transformation.